The courtroom didn't expect her to look like that. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Not the charges, not the headlines, not the whispers floating through the rows of spectators. It was her presence. She was only 19 years old, young enough that some people instinctively looked toward the back of the room, expecting to see her parents sitting nearby. But she sat alone. No family behind her. No lawyer speaking in hushed tones. Just her, back straight, hands folded calmly, eyes steady, and that silence around her felt heavier than anything anyone had heard before. Judge Raymond Whitaker adjusted his glasses slowly as he entered the courtroom. He had presided over hundreds of cases in his 30 years on the bench: violent crimes, heartbreaking testimonies, complicated legal battles. Nothing surprised him anymore, or at least, that's what he believed. Until he saw her. He paused for a fraction of a second. Not long enough for most people to notice, but long enough for the courtroom clerk to glance at him briefly. There was something unusual about the way she held herself. Not defensive, not scared, not angry, just calm, too calm. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Everyone rose. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. The energy in the room shifted immediately. This wasn't just another case. The media had filled the back rows. Reporters sat ready with notebooks open. Camera operators waited outside for any glimpse of drama, because this case had already gone viral before it even reached trial. A 19-year-old black woman accused of something so shocking that people argued about it online for weeks. Some called her dangerous. Others called her misunderstood. Many didn't know what to believe, but everyone wanted to see what would happen. Judge Whitaker sat down slowly. His eyes returned to her again. She didn't look away. That surprised him. Most defendants avoided eye contact. Fear showed in their posture. Defensiveness. Shame. But her gaze was steady. Not challenging. Not submissive. Just present. "What is your name for the record?" he asked. The room grew quiet. Even the reporters stopped writing for a moment. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but clear. Amani Carter. No hesitation. No trembling. Just truth. Judge Whitaker nodded slightly. "Amani Carter," he repeated. He studied her face carefully. There was something in her expression that unsettled him. Not arrogance. Not innocence either. Something deeper. Something resolved. The prosecutor stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "Your Honor, the state is ready to proceed." Amani remained still. The public defender beside her shuffled papers nervously. He looked tired, overwhelmed, as if he already expected the outcome. And maybe everyone else did too. Except her. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Carter, do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And how do you plead?" The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment. This was the part everyone came to hear. Amani looked directly at the judge, and for the first time, something flickered behind her calm eyes. Not fear, not regret, something closer to determination. "Guilty," she said quietly. Gasps spread through the room. Reporters began scribbling furiously. Someone in the back whispered loudly enough that the bailiff turned toward them. Judge Whitaker lifted his hand. Silence returned instantly. He studied her again. Something felt wrong. Not legally wrong. Emotionally wrong. People who pleaded guilty usually carried visible weight. Tension. Shame. Relief. But Amani's expression hadn't changed. It was as if she had already accepted something no one else understood. He cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter, you understand that by pleading guilty you are waiving your right to trial?" "Yes." "And you understand the consequences?" "Yes." Her voice remained steady. Too steady. The judge felt an unexpected curiosity rise inside him. He rarely felt curiosity toward defendants anymore. Years had hardened him, but something about her presence disrupted his usual detachment. The prosecutor began outlining the facts of the case. Each sentence landed heavily. Each detail painted a picture the audience struggled to reconcile with the young woman sitting calmly before them. And as he spoke, Amani didn't react. No tears, no anger, no interruption, just silence. Then, halfway through the prosecutor's summary, Judge Whitaker noticed something. The gallery, normally restless, had grown completely still. No shifting, no whispering. Even the reporters had stopped writing. Everyone was watching her. Not the lawyer, not the judge. Her, because somehow, without speaking, she had taken control of the room. And Judge Whitaker realized something unsettling. He wasn't the one guiding the emotional atmosphere anymore. She was, and she hadn't even begun to speak. The prosecutor finished. The judge nodded slowly. "Ms. Carter," he said carefully, "before sentencing, you have the right to make a statement." The public defender leaned toward her urgently, whispering something, probably advising caution, probably reminding her what to say. But Amani shook her head slightly, not dismissively, just certain. She stood. The movement was small, but the effect was immediate. The courtroom seemed to tighten around her. She looked at the judge, and then she spoke. "Before I say anything, I need you to promise you'll listen." A ripple moved through the room. That wasn't how defendants spoke to judges. Judge Whitaker felt his eyebrows lift slightly. "You may proceed," he said. She inhaled slowly, and when she spoke again, everything changed. The air inside the courtroom changed the moment she stood up. It wasn't dramatic. There was no loud movement, no sudden noise, just a shift, like the invisible pressure before a storm breaks. Judge Whitaker had seen hundreds of defendants stand before him. Some trembled, some cried, some tried to argue desperately against the inevitable. But Amani Carter stood as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Her shoulders were relaxed, her breathing steady, and her eyes, they didn't wander, they didn't plead. They held his gaze with a quiet intensity that made him sit a little straighter without realizing why. "Before I say anything," she repeated softly, "I need you to promise you'll listen." A murmur moved through the gallery again. That wasn't how courtroom statements usually began. The judge felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward him. He cleared his throat. "You have the court's attention," he said. It was a neutral answer, professional, but inside, he felt something unusual, curiosity mixed with caution. Amani nodded slowly, as if acknowledging something deeper than his words. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Every syllable landed clearly. "I know what everyone thinks when they look at me." The prosecutor shifted slightly in his seat. The public defender stopped shuffling papers. Even the bailiff seemed more alert. "They think they already know who I am," she continued, "because of the charges, because of what they heard on the news, because of how I look sitting here." Her eyes moved briefly across the room, not defensively, just observant, and maybe they're right about some things. She paused. The silence stretched. Nobody moved. "I said I was guilty," she said quietly, "and I meant it." Judge Whitaker nodded slightly. "But guilt," she continued, "and truth aren't always the same thing." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The prosecutor immediately rose halfway from his chair. "Your Honor." Judge Whitaker lifted a hand gently. "Let her continue." He surprised himself by saying it, but something inside him insisted this mattered. Amani's eyes returned to him. Gratitude flickered there for a brief moment, subtle but unmistakable. "When people hear about this case," she said slowly, "they imagine a monster or a victim, but nobody ever asks how someone becomes either." A reporter's pen stopped mid-sentence. Somewhere in the back, someone exhaled sharply. The room was no longer just watching. It was listening, and Amani seemed to feel it. She swallowed softly. "I wasn't born angry," she said. "I wasn't born broken. I wasn't born dangerous." Her voice remained calm, but beneath it was something deeper. Not sadness, not rage, something closer to exhaustion. "I was just a kid who learned very early that silence can be louder than screaming." The judge felt his chest tighten slightly. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way she said it. Maybe it was the way the room seemed to shrink around her words. "What happened that night?" she continued carefully. "Didn't start that night." The prosecutor shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. This wasn't the narrative he wanted, but Judge Whitaker remained still, listening, waiting. "You asked me if I understood the consequences of my plea," she said, turning back toward him. "And I do. I understand I could lose years of my life. I understand people may never see me differently." She paused. "But I need you to understand something too." The judge felt a strange heaviness settle inside him. "What is that?" he asked quietly. Her eyes softened. That sometimes the loudest moment in a person's life comes from years of being unheard. The words landed like a physical weight. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the air felt still. Amani took another breath. Her hands trembled slightly now, the first crack in her calm exterior. And somehow, that tiny movement made her feel more real than ever. "When I was younger," she said slowly, "I learned that telling the truth didn't always make people listen." She looked down briefly, then back up. "So eventually, you stopped talking." The judge leaned forward slightly, without realizing. "And then," she continued, "one day something happens that makes silence impossible." The courtroom felt frozen. Everyone knew she was getting closer to the heart of the story, closer to the moment everyone wanted to understand. But the way she spoke made it feel different. Not sensational, not dramatic, just human. "You see," she said quietly, "everyone thinks that night was about anger." Her eyes flickered with emotion for the first time, but it wasn't. A long pause followed, and then she said something that made even the judge's breath catch slightly. It was about fear. The word echoed softly. Fear, not rage, not violence. Fear. Judge Whitaker felt something shift inside him, a crack forming in the wall of professional distance he had built over decades. He realized he wasn't just hearing a defendant speak. He was hearing a story that might change how the entire courtroom understood this case. And somehow, he knew she wasn't finished. Not even close. The word lingered in the air. Fear. Not anger. Not violence. Fear. Judge Whitaker felt the subtle shift ripple through the courtroom like a quiet wave. He had heard countless explanations from defendants before. Excuses disguised as trauma. Carefully rehearsed statements meant to reduce sentences. But this felt different. Not defensive. Not manipulative. Just honest. Amani stood perfectly still, as if allowing the weight of that single word to settle into every corner of the room. "When people hear what I did," she continued softly, "they assume I lost control." She shook her head slightly, but I didn't. That made several spectators exchange uneasy glances. The prosecutor's pen paused mid-note. "I made a choice," she said clearly, "and I'm not here to pretend I didn't." Judge Whitaker nodded slowly, acknowledging the responsibility in her words. But something else lingered beneath her tone, something unresolved. "And yet," he said gently, "you said it began long before that night." Amani's eyes softened. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice lowered slightly, and suddenly the courtroom felt less like a legal space and more like a confession chamber. "I grew up learning how to disappear," she said. The judge felt his breath slow. "What do you mean by that?" he asked. She hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Not fear, but vulnerability. "When you grow up in a place where people only notice you when you make mistakes," she said slowly, "you learn to stay quiet when you're hurting." The words felt deeply personal, unscripted, raw. She glanced briefly toward the gallery, rows of strangers who had come to watch her story unfold like entertainment. "People see a headline," she said softly. "They don't see the years before it." Her hands trembled slightly again. She clasped them together tighter. "My mother worked 3 jobs," she continued. "She loved me, but she was always tired, always trying to survive." A murmur of empathy moved through the room, and when she got sick, Amani paused, swallowing hard. Everything changed. Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly. He didn't interrupt. He sensed she needed space. "I was 16, she said, "and suddenly I was the adult." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes glistened faintly under the courtroom lights. Bills didn't stop. School didn't stop. Expectations didn't stop. She inhaled slowly, and nobody asked if I was okay. The silence deepened. It felt heavier now, no longer just curiosity, but shared emotional tension. "When you carry too much for too long," she said quietly, "you start believing that your pain doesn't matter." The judge felt something stir in his chest. He had heard stories of hardship before, but something about the way she spoke, without anger, without blame, made it harder to maintain professional distance. "And the night of the incident," he asked gently, Amani's shoulders stiffened slightly. "That was the first time I felt truly afraid," she said. Her voice cracked just enough to reveal the emotional weight beneath her control. "I wasn't thinking about consequences. I wasn't thinking about law or punishment." She let down briefly. "I was thinking about survival." The prosecutor shifted again. He seemed ready to object, to steer the narrative back toward legal definitions. But he didn't, because even he seemed caught by the gravity of her words. Judge Whitaker noticed something extraordinary. The entire courtroom, dozens of people, sat completely still. No whispers, no rustling papers. Even the subtle background noises of breathing felt quieter. She had done something he rarely witnessed. She had made strangers feel connected to her story. "When fear takes over," she said slowly, "your brain doesn't ask what's right. It asks what will keep you alive." Her eyes lifted again, locked onto the judge, and that's what I did. A long pause followed. Judge Whitaker considered his next words carefully. "Ms. Carter," he said softly, "are you saying you felt threatened?" "Yes." The answer came immediately, but she didn't elaborate yet. Instead, she took a slow breath. "As a judge," he continued carefully, "my responsibility is to understand not only what happened but why." Amani nodded slightly. "And that's why I asked you to promise you would listen," she said. Her voice softened further, "because nobody has really listened before." The words landed heavily, not accusatory, just truthful. The judge felt something shift again inside him, a growing awareness that this moment might change more than just one case. "Tell me," he said quietly, and something in his tone changed. Less authority, more humanity. Amani noticed. Everyone noticed. She took a long breath, and for the first time, her calm seemed to crack just slightly, not into chaos, but into something deeper. Emotion. "I didn't plan to speak this much today," she admitted softly. A faint, almost sad smile crossed her lips. "But when you spend years silent, words come all at once." Somewhere in the gallery, someone wiped their eyes. The judge watched carefully. "What happened that night?" she said slowly. "Started with someone who didn't believe me when I said I was scared." The room tightened instantly, and Judge Whitaker realized they were about to reach the heart of the story. The room felt smaller now, not physically, emotionally, as if every word Amani spoke pressed the walls closer together. Judge Whitaker folded his hands slowly on the bench. He didn't interrupt. He sensed instinctively that if he rushed her now, something important would be lost. "What happened that night?" she repeated softly. "Started with someone who didn't believe me when I said I was scared." Her voice trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from memory. "When fear is invisible," she continued, "people assume it isn't real." The judge nodded faintly. He had heard similar words before, but rarely with such quiet conviction. "Tell me about that night," he said gently. Amani inhaled slowly. The entire courtroom seemed to inhale with her. "It was late," she began. "I had just finished work. I was exhausted, and I was trying to hold everything together." Her eyes flickered briefly, recalling something painful. "I remember thinking I just needed one normal day." A faint, sad smile crossed her lips. "But life doesn't always give you normal." She paused, long enough that the silence itself became part of the story. "I was walking home," she said finally, "and at first, nothing felt wrong." Her voice slowed, measured, each word deliberate, but then I realized someone was following me. A ripple moved through the gallery. Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "What made you believe that?" he asked. "The footsteps," she said immediately. "They stopped when I stopped. They started when I started." Her hands tightened together. "I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired, that I shouldn't assume the worst." She swallowed, but the feeling didn't go away. The judge felt the tension tighten around the room. What happened next? Amani hesitated. For the first time since she began speaking, fear crossed her face openly. "I turned around," she said quietly, and he smiled. A low murmur spread through the spectators. The judge lifted his hand slightly, not to silence them harshly, but to preserve the fragile atmosphere she had created. "He said I was overreacting," she continued, "that he was just walking." Her eyes hardened slightly now. not with anger, but with remembered vulnerability. But something inside me knew I wasn't safe. The words landed heavily. "Did you know this person?" the judge asked. She shook her head slowly. "No." Another pause. "And when I tried to walk faster," she continued, "he walked faster too." The prosecutor shifted again, but still said nothing. Even he seemed pulled into the emotional gravity of the story. "I started to panic," she admitted softly. Not screaming panic, the quiet kind. The kind where your brain starts calculating escape routes. The judge's jaw tightened slightly. He imagined a scenario. A young woman, alone, late at night, fear growing slowly. "And then," he asked gently. Amani's voice lowered. He grabbed my arm. Gasps spread through the room. Several people leaned forward instinctively. "I told him to let go," she said. "I told him I didn't know him." Her breathing became slightly uneven now, the calm exterior cracking just enough to reveal the emotional cost of reliving the moment. He laughed. The single word felt sharp, cold. "And that's when I knew," she whispered. "I wasn't imagining anything." Judge Whitaker felt his chest tighten. The narrative he had initially assumed, the one shaped by reports and legal summaries, suddenly felt incomplete. "And what did you do?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. Her eyes flickered downward, then back up. "I reacted," she said simply. The courtroom seemed to freeze. Everyone knew they were approaching the moment that had brought her here. "The reports say you..." The prosecutor began cautiously. Judge Whitaker lifted a hand again. "Not now." Amani continued. "I had something in my bag," she said slowly. "A small tool. Something for protection." Her voice was steady again, but softer now. "I didn't plan to use it." She swallowed. But when he wouldn't let go, a long silence followed. Heavy, unavoidable. "I was afraid I wouldn't make it home." The words felt like a confession and a defense at the same time. "And so," she said quietly, "I made a choice." The judge felt the entire courtroom lean into that moment. Every person waiting, every breath suspended, and everything changed after that. Judge Whitaker sat back slowly. For the first time since the hearing began, doubt entered his thoughts, not about her guilt, but about the story behind it. He realized something unsettling. The version of events he had read in the official report suddenly felt incomplete, flattened, stripped of humanity. And now, standing before him, was a 19-year-old who had just reshaped the emotional landscape of the courtroom without raising her voice once. He looked at her carefully. "Ms. Carter," he said quietly, "what happened after you reacted?" Her eyes softened, and something deeper, something heavier, settled into her expression. "That," she whispered, "is the part nobody listened to." The silence inside the courtroom wasn't just quiet anymore. It felt fragile, like glass stretched thin, waiting for something to crack it. Judge Whitaker watched Amani carefully. He had heard hundreds of testimonies describing fear, but something about the way she spoke made him feel like he wasn't just hearing about fear. He was standing inside it. "That," she whispered, "is the part nobody listened to." Her words hung heavy in the air. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Then help us understand," he said gently. The shift in his tone didn't go unnoticed. The authority was still there, but beneath it was something softer, something human. Amani nodded slowly. Her breathing grew deeper, steadier, as if she was preparing to step into a memory she had avoided for a long time. "After I reacted," she said quietly, "everything became loud." Her fingers tightened around each other. "I remember the sound of my own heartbeat. I remember his voice changing." She swallowed. It wasn't laughing anymore. The room leaned into her words, and then he fell. Gasps moved through the spectators. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed slightly, listening carefully. Judge Whitaker remained still. "What did you feel in that moment?" he asked. Amani hesitated. For several seconds, she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. Relief. The honesty of the answer made several people shift in their seats. And then, she added quickly, "Terror." Her eyes shimmered faintly, because I realized everything had changed. She looked down briefly, as if replaying the moment in her mind. "I didn't run," she said. "I didn't scream." Her voice dropped lower. I just stood there shaking. The judge felt a tightness form in his chest. He could imagine it. The shock after adrenaline fades, the silence after chaos. "And someone called the police?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Not me." A faint bitterness touched her tone, but it wasn't anger, just exhaustion. They arrived fast. Her eyes flickered again, and from that moment, I wasn't the girl who was afraid anymore. A long pause followed. I was the suspect. The words landed with heavy weight. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. "I tried to explain," she continued. "I tried to tell them what happened." Her voice grew quieter. "But once people decide who you are, they stop hearing anything else." Judge Whitaker felt a subtle discomfort move through him. He knew how investigations worked. He knew how narratives formed quickly. He also knew how difficult it could be to undo them. "What did they say to you?" he asked. Amani's lips pressed together briefly. "They said I should have walked away." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. I remember thinking, how do you walk away from someone holding you? The question lingered heavily. Even the prosecutor didn't move. The judge felt something shift deeper inside him. He had read the police report. The language had been clinical, objective, detached. But hearing her describe it now felt completely different. "What happened after the arrest?" he asked carefully. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Everything became quiet again. She paused, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. She looked at him directly, the lonely kind. The judge swallowed slowly. "No one wanted to hear about fear anymore," she said. "They wanted facts, charges, headlines." Her eyes softened, and I understood that. I really did. She took a breath. "But nobody asked how it felt to go from being scared for your life to being told you were dangerous." The words hit the courtroom like a wave. Somewhere in the back, someone sniffled quietly. Amani noticed, but she didn't turn. She kept her focus on the judge. "I said I was guilty," she continued gently, "because I made a choice that changed someone else's life forever." The judge nodded slowly. "But guilt," she repeated softly, "doesn't mean I wasn't afraid." Her voice trembled slightly now, the strongest crack in her calm since she began speaking. "And it doesn't mean I wanted any of this." The courtroom felt heavier. Emotion pressed against every corner. Judge Whitaker realized something unsettling. He had entered this hearing expecting procedure, expected legal clarity. But instead, he was witnessing something rare, a moment where law and humanity collided, and neither could easily win. He looked at her carefully. "Ms. Carter," he said quietly, "what is it you want this court to understand most?" She didn't answer immediately. She took a slow breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried more weight than anything she had said before. "I want you to understand that I didn't silence someone that night." She paused. I found my voice. The words hit the room like thunder disguised as a whisper. And for the first time, Judge Whitaker felt his own certainty begin to fracture. The courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a space holding its breath. Amani stood quietly after her last words. I found my voice. No one moved. Not the prosecutor. Not the reporters. Not even the judge. Judge Whitaker realized something strange was happening. For years, he had controlled every room he entered. His presence set the tone. His words defined the direction. But now, the emotional center of the room belonged to her. And she wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't arguing. She was simply telling the truth as she experienced it. He cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence. "Ms. Carter," he said gently, "you said people stopped listening once the narrative formed." "Yes," she replied. No hesitation. "Can you explain what you mean by that?" She nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for that question. "When the police arrived," she said, "they saw a young black woman standing over someone who had been hurt." Her voice remained steady, but the words carried weight. They didn't see the fear that came before that moment. The judge felt an uncomfortable truth settle in his mind. The first image often becomes the permanent image. "What did they ask you?" he said. Amani's lips pressed together briefly. "They asked why I didn't run." A faint bitterness crept into her voice, but it wasn't anger toward any one person. It sounded more like exhaustion with misunderstanding. "And what did you say?" She looked at him directly. I said I froze. The simplicity of the answer made several people in the courtroom shift slightly. "That happens sometimes," she continued softly. "Your body chooses stillness because it doesn't know what else to do." The judge nodded slowly. He had heard experts describe that reaction, the freeze response, but hearing it from her made it feel more real, more human. "They wrote things down," she continued. "They used words that sounded official." Her voice lowered, "But they didn't write how scared I felt." Silence followed, heavy, honest, and when I tried to explain more, she paused. "They told me to wait until later." She laughed softly, but it was hollow. Later never came. The judge felt a subtle tightening in his chest. He knew the system moved fast. He knew procedures often replaced personal understanding, but hearing the emotional consequences of that reality felt different. He glanced briefly at the prosecutor. The man looked thoughtful now, less rigid than before. Something about Amani's story was shifting even his perspective. "What happened when you arrived at the station?" the judge asked gently. Amani hesitated longer this time. Her breathing slowed. The room felt even quieter. "I felt small," she said finally. The words sounded simple, but they carried enormous weight. "I wasn't Amani anymore. I was a case number." Several people in the gallery lowered their eyes. She noticed, and for the first time, her expression softened with something like empathy. Not for herself, but for them. "I'm not saying anyone meant to hurt me," she said carefully. "I know people were doing their jobs." Her tone carried no accusation, only reflection. But sometimes, doing your job still hurt someone. Judge Whitaker felt those words land deeply. He thought about every defendant who had stood before him over the years. How many stories had he reduced to legal summaries? How many moments of humanity had been flattened by procedure? He shifted slightly in his chair. "When did you decide to plead guilty?" he asked. Her eyes flickered briefly, remembering. "In the holding room," she said. "So quickly?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I was tired," she admitted. The honesty stunned the room. "Not physically," she added. "Emotionally." She paused. "When you feel like nobody sees the full picture, you stop fighting to explain it." A quiet sound came from the gallery, someone crying softly. The judge glanced toward the back rows. A middle-aged woman wiped tears from her face. Amani noticed too. Her expression softened again. Not surprised, not embarrassed, just understanding. "I wasn't trying to escape responsibility," she continued. "I just didn't believe my voice mattered." The judge felt a heaviness settle over him, and suddenly, he realized something deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't just about her story. It was about the system itself, and the way silence sometimes formed inside it. "What changed today?" he asked quietly. Amani took a long breath. Her eyes met his again. "You listened." The simplicity of the answer stunned him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was sincere. "And when someone listens," she added softly, "it makes you brave enough to tell the rest." The judge leaned back slightly. He felt something unfamiliar rising inside him. Not doubt, not certainty, something in between, understanding. And he realized the courtroom had been transformed by a 19-year-old who simply refused to hide her humanity. The courtroom felt heavier than before, not tense, not hostile, just deeply present. Judge Whitaker realized something unusual. No one was waiting for drama anymore. They were waiting for truth. Amani stood quietly after her last words, her shoulders rising and falling slowly as she steadied her breathing. He noticed something he hadn't seen earlier. Her calm wasn't confidence. It was control, the kind people develop when they've spent years learning how to survive emotions quietly. "Ms. Carter," he said gently, "you mentioned that people decided who you were before hearing the full story." "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was soft but unwavering. "What part of your story do you believe was never understood?" The question hung in the air like an open door. Amani hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because saying it aloud felt like crossing a line she had protected for years. Her fingers tightened slightly. The judge waited patiently. No pressure, just space. "When I was 14, she said slowly, I learned what it feels like when fear lives inside your body every day." The words shifted the energy immediately. Several people leaned forward instinctively. "What do you mean?" the judge asked softly. Her eyes dropped briefly toward the floor. "I mean," she said quietly, "that the first time I asked for help, nobody believed me." A subtle ripple moved through the room. Amani lifted her gaze again. "I told a teacher I felt unsafe at home." Her voice remained steady, but something fragile moved beneath it. "They said I was probably exaggerating." The judge felt something tighten inside his chest, and after that, she paused. "I stopped asking." The simplicity of the statement felt devastating. Not dramatic, just real. She continued slowly. "When you grow up learning that your fear isn't taken seriously, you start believing you have to handle everything alone." The prosecutor lowered his eyes briefly. Even he seemed affected now. "And when I got older," she said, "I promised myself that if I ever felt that kind of fear again, I wouldn't stay silent." Her words connected back to everything she had said earlier. The judge realized she wasn't just describing one night. She was describing years, layers, moments that built into the person standing before him. "That night," she continued quietly, "wasn't just about one man grabbing my arm." She paused. "It was about every time I felt powerless before that." The courtroom fell into complete stillness. The emotional weight pressed heavily against everyone present. "And when I reacted," she said softly, "I wasn't just reacting to him." She swallowed slowly. "I was reacting to years of feeling like nobody would protect me if I didn't protect myself." A sharp breath came from somewhere in the gallery. Someone wiped their eyes openly now. Judge Whitaker felt his own thoughts shifting. He had always believed justice required clarity, clear actions, clear consequences. But now he felt something more complicated unfolding. Understanding. "I need to ask you something difficult," he said carefully. Amani nodded. "I expected that." His voice softened. "Do you believe you had no other choice?" She didn't answer immediately. The pause felt honest, not calculated. Finally, she spoke. "I believe I chose the only thing I believed would keep me safe in that moment." Her answer wasn't defensive. It was reflective and deeply human. The judge leaned back slowly. He felt the room change again. Not just empathy now. Respect. Because she wasn't asking for pity. She was asking to be understood fully. The prosecutor cleared his throat quietly. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, "may I ask a question?" The judge nodded. He turned toward Amani. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone noticeably softer than earlier. "If someone had listened to you sooner, do you think things might have been different?" Amani's eyes softened. "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. "Because when people feel heard," she continued gently, "they don't carry everything alone." The simplicity of her words landed deeply. Judge Whitaker felt a realization forming. This wasn't just a story about one incident. It was about what happens when silence builds over time, until it becomes unbearable. He looked at her carefully, and for the first time, he felt less like a judge evaluating a case, and more like a human witnessing another human's truth. The courtroom, once filled with curiosity and judgment, now felt united by something else entirely, understanding. And the reason she had silenced everyone wasn't power, it was honesty. The silence felt different now. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It wasn't tension either. It was understanding slowly taking shape. Judge Whitaker sat very still. He had spent decades believing that emotional distance helped him remain fair. That separating feeling from law allowed him to deliver justice without bias. But Amani's words were breaking through that carefully built wall. "When people feel unheard," she had said. The sentence echoed in his mind. He realized he wasn't just hearing a defendant speak. He was hearing something much larger, something about the system itself. He leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Carter," he said softly, "earlier you said that fear lived inside you long before that night." "Yes." Her answer came gently, without hesitation. "What does fear feel like to you?" he asked. The question surprised several people in the room. It wasn't legal. It wasn't procedural. It was human. Amani blinked slowly, as if she hadn't expected that question either. Then she smiled faintly, not happily, but with recognition. "Fear," she said quietly, Feels like being invisible and exposed at the same time. The words settled heavily, like you're screaming inside, but everyone outside sees silence. The judge felt his chest tighten, and when you live with that long enough, she continued, you stop asking for permission to survive. The courtroom remained completely still. Even the faint rustle of clothing had disappeared. Judge Whitaker felt a sudden memory surface, something he hadn't thought about in years. A young man he had sentenced early in his career. The boy had tried to explain something similar. The judge had interrupted him. Time was limited. Procedure mattered. He had believed he was doing his job. But now, he wondered what story he had never heard fully. He shook the thought away gently and returned to Amani. "Do you believe the law failed you?" he asked carefully. She paused. The question was heavy, dangerous, but she didn't answer defensively. "No," she said finally. The simplicity of her response surprised everyone. "I believe people inside the law sometimes forget what fear feels like." The honesty landed softly, without accusation. The judge nodded slowly. That felt true and uncomfortable. He noticed the prosecutor watching her differently now. Not as an opponent, as a person. "What do you want from this moment?" he asked. Her eyes softened. "I don't want sympathy," she said. "I don't want people to pretend I didn't make a choice." Her voice grew steadier. "I just want the full story to exist." The words felt powerful in their simplicity, because that was what she had been doing since she began speaking, rebuilding her story piece by piece. "And why is that important to you?" he asked. She hesitated. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the gallery, toward strangers who now looked at her differently. "When people only see the worst moment of your life," she said quietly, "they think that moment defines who you are." She swallowed. "But people are more than one moment." A quiet sob came from somewhere behind her. No one turned. No one wanted to break the fragile emotional space she had created. Judge Whitaker felt a deep shift inside himself. He realized something he had rarely allowed himself to consider openly. Justice wasn't just about deciding what happened. It was about understanding why. And understanding required listening, truly listening. He leaned back slowly. The courtroom waited, and for the first time since the hearing began, he didn't know what he would say next. Not because he lacked authority, but because he felt the weight of responsibility differently now. Amani stood calmly, watching him, not demanding, not pleading, just present. And somehow, that presence felt stronger than any argument he had ever heard. The courtroom had stopped feeling like a place of judgment long ago. Now it felt like something else entirely. A space where truth had weight, where silence meant listening, not avoidance. Judge Whitaker rested his hand slowly against the bench, staring at Amani with a level of attention he hadn't given any defendant in years. She stood calmly, not pleading, not demanding, just present, and somehow that presence filled the room more than any raised voice ever could. He inhaled slowly. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice quieter now, more reflective than authoritative. "In 30 years, I have heard thousands of stories." He paused, "and very few have made me reconsider the way I listen." A soft ripple moved through the courtroom. Reporters froze, sensing the shift. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't routine. This was real. Amani didn't speak. She simply listened, the same way she had asked him to do for her. The judge continued. "When I began my career," he said slowly, "I believed justice was about separating emotion from law." He hesitated, as if choosing each word carefully. "I believed fairness required distance." A long silence followed. "And maybe," he added softly, "that distance protected me from feeling the weight of every decision." His admission stunned the room. Judges rarely revealed personal reflection, but something about this moment made formality feel unnecessary. Amani watched him carefully, not surprised, just understanding. The judge leaned forward slightly. "But today," he said, "you reminded me that justice without understanding risks becoming incomplete." The words landed gently, but heavily. The prosecutor lowered his gaze. The public defender blinked rapidly, visibly emotional. Amani's eyes softened, not because she had won something, but because she had been heard. The judge turned briefly toward the gallery. "I want everyone here to understand something," he said. This court is not just a place to determine guilt. His voice grew firmer. It is a place to seek truth. He returned his gaze to her. And truth, he added quietly, is rarely simple. The room held still. He took a long breath. You have admitted responsibility, he said. Yes, she replied softly. And you have spoken with honesty, he continued. She nodded faintly. But you have also revealed context that cannot be ignored. Amani swallowed slowly. For the first time since she began speaking, uncertainty flickered across her face. Not fear of punishment, but vulnerability about what would come next. The judge paused. He looked down briefly at the papers before him, the legal summaries, the reports, the structured version of events that now felt incomplete compared to the living story he had just heard. He closed the folder gently. Then he looked up. When you entered this courtroom today, he said, many people believed they already understood who you were. The gallery shifted slightly. But you did something rare, he continued. You changed the way people listened. Amani blinked slowly. Emotion shimmered behind her calm expression. You did not silence this courtroom with force, he said softly. You silenced it with honesty. A quiet sob broke from someone in the back row. No one reacted. The moment felt too sacred to interrupt. The judge straightened slightly. His voice grew steady again, but still warm. Justice requires accountability, he said, and it also requires compassion. He paused. And sometimes the greatest responsibility of this court is recognizing the difference between danger and survival. Amani's breath caught softly. He continued, based on the full context presented and your acceptance of responsibility, this court finds that punishment alone would fail to serve justice. The room held its breath. I am ordering a structured rehabilitation program, he said, combined with supervised community support rather than extended incarceration. Gasps spread softly, some surprised, some relieved, but the judge raised his hand gently. This is not leniency, he said firmly. This is justice informed by understanding. He looked directly at Amani. You acted out of fear, he said, and you must learn to live beyond it. Her eyes filled with tears now, silent, controlled, but undeniable. You are not defined by one moment, he continued quietly, but you are responsible for what comes after it. She nodded slowly. I understand, she whispered. The judge softened his tone. I believe you do. A long silence followed. Then he added something unexpected. Before today ends, I want to say something not as a judge, but as a person. The courtroom froze. I am sorry, he said gently, for every moment you felt unheard before this one. The words broke something open in the room. Several people began crying openly now. Even the bailiff looked away briefly. Amani's shoulders shook slightly as tears finally fell freely down her face. Not from fear, not from defeat, from release. Because after years of silence, someone had finally listened. The judge nodded slowly. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck softly, but nobody moved immediately, because something profound had happened. A 19-year-old had walked into a courtroom labeled by her worst moment, and she had walked out having changed the way everyone inside understood justice itself.